Far out on the edge of known space, in a region where stars were few and the darkness seemed endless, a small alien colony struggled to survive. The colony was not large by galactic standards. It was a collection of interlinked habitats, some floating like islands in the void, others built on rocky asteroids that had been hollowed out to form living spaces. These aliens, a peaceful and intelligent species, had lived in this sector for generations, quietly mining resources, studying the stars, and building a community that was thriving despite the harshness of their surroundings. They were used to the loneliness of space, the constant vigilance against minor cosmic hazards, and the delicate balance needed to sustain life in such a remote corner of the universe. Yet nothing could have prepared them for the catastrophe that was now unfolding. The first signs of trouble had appeared subtly. Power fluctuations in the colony's energy grid had caused lights to flicker, and minor system failures had begun to occur in the life support modules. Engineers worked tirelessly, but even they were beginning to feel a sense of unease. These incidents had been small at first, easy to fix, but soon the problems grew more severe. Communication arrays began transmitting static, and sensors picked up strange, high-energy phenomena moving through nearby space, phenomena that no one could identify or understand. Panic was not immediate, because the colony had faced challenges before, but the unease settled like a cold shadow over the entire population. Then, the attacks began. Not traditional attacks, not from another intelligent species, but from forces that were beyond comprehension. Cosmic storms erupted without warning, tearing through the fragile shields of the colony. Strange bursts of radiation damaged critical systems, and in some habitats, life support failed entirely. Panic spread quickly. Families huddled together, unsure whether to flee or to wait for the systems to recover. The scientists and leaders of the colony scrambled to analyze the situation, trying to find a pattern, a reason, a solution. Days passed and the problem only worsened. Entire sections of the colony were destroyed, and many lives were lost before the survivors even had a chance to process what was happening. In desperation, the council of the colony decided to send out a distress signal. This was not a small act. Sending an SOS across such vast distances was dangerous, and almost certainly a final hope. They programmed the message to broadcast in all directions, reaching out to any intelligent life that might be listening, anyone who could come to their aid. The message described the situation in detail: the attacks, the destruction, the imminent threat to the survival of the colony. It was heartfelt, precise, and desperately pleading. The aliens hoped that somewhere in the galaxy, a being capable of understanding their language, their situation, and their need for help, would hear the signal and respond. The signal did not go unnoticed. Far away, in a part of the galaxy where legends were whispered about a race unlike any other, the SOS reached the ears of the Deathworlders. They were a species known for their extraordinary strength, intelligence, and most of all, military dominance. Entire civilizations had learned to fear them, as their ships were massive, their weapons devastating, and their approach unpredictable. Stories of the Deathworlders were told across multiple systems: how they had conquered hostile planets, how they had survived in environments that no other species could, and how their judgment was harsh and often deadly. Yet the colony had never encountered them before and had only heard faint rumors. To them, the SOS was a call for help, and the possibility of aid arriving was something to cling to in their darkest hour. The Deathworlders, for their part, were intrigued by the signal. It was rare that a species broadcasted such an urgent SOS. Even rarer that it came from a sector where few civilizations ventured. They analyzed the message carefully, decoding its meaning, studying the situation from every angle. Yet their understanding of help was very different from what the aliens imagined. To the Deathworlders, strength was shown through power, through overwhelming force, not through delicate rescue operations. The concept of simply providing resources, repairing damage, or evacuating a colony in a gentle manner was alien to them. Their response would be calculated, powerful, and absolute. Back at the colony, hope flickered. Families gathered around communication consoles, watching the lights that signaled that the message had been sent and possibly received. Engineers continued to repair what systems they could, trying to hold the habitats together. The council debated strategies. Should they attempt to flee to nearby asteroids? Should they prepare for boarding? No one had any clear answers. The fear in the community was palpable, but so was the fragile thread of hope that the SOS might bring help. that someone out there, somewhere in the galaxy, might come to save them. As hours passed, scans of nearby space began to detect movement. Massive, unfamiliar shapes emerged from the darkness at the edge of their sensors. The aliens were mesmerized and terrified. These were not ships like their own, nor anything they had ever seen in simulations or illustrations. The Deathworlders' vessels were enormous, almost impossibly large, bristling with strange technology and weapons that made the colony's defenses look like children's toys. The scale of the fleet was breathtaking, and even before any communication was established, the sheer presence of the Deathworlders communicated something powerful, overwhelming and frightening. The aliens began to wonder, had they made a mistake? Had their plea for help inadvertently summoned a force they could not understand or control? The SOS, intended as a beacon of hope, had done exactly what it was supposed to do. It had been received. But hope was complicated when the responders were beings whose understanding of aid was intertwined with power and destruction. The colony faced a reality they had never imagined. The beings who answered their call might not be allies in the way they had envisioned. Fear mingled with curiosity. Scientists tried to observe the Deathworlders from afar, attempting to determine their intentions, but the answers were unclear. The fleet moved with purpose, but their actions did not yet indicate rescue. The alien sensors detected energy signatures that suggested both defensive and offensive capabilities. Families huddled together, listening to the faint hum of approaching ships, unable to comprehend what might come next. The air was heavy with tension as each second stretched endlessly into the unknown. Despite the fear, the Council encouraged everyone to maintain hope. In the midst of terror, hope was the one thing that kept the community together. Children were comforted, elders shared stories of resilience, and the colony braced itself for whatever arrival the Deathworlders would bring. In the quiet moments before contact, the alien population reflected on their existence, the beauty of their floating habitats, the achievements of their people, and the fragility of life in a universe so vast and unpredictable. It was a moment of reflection, fear, and anticipation all at once. And then finally, the first signs of the Deathworlders' approach were unmistakable. Lights from their massive ships shimmered in the distance, casting shadows over the colony's habitats. The aliens could feel the intensity of their presence, a pressure that was almost physical, like the gravity of fear pressing against them. The hope that the SOS had carried was still there, mingled now with a growing sense of dread. The colony realized even in that moment that the help they had asked for might not bring salvation. It might bring something far more dangerous, far more overwhelming than they had imagined. The stage was set for the arrival of the Deathworlders. The aliens, fragile and unprepared, watched as the unknown force moved closer. They did not know if their fate would be one of rescue, negotiation, or annihilation. The universe was about to teach them a lesson about power, unpredictability, and the stark difference between hope and reality. Their SOS, sent in desperation, had reached its target, but whether it would save them or destroy them was a question that only the coming hours would answer. The moment the Deathworlders' ships finally appeared on the colony's sensors, the aliens could hardly believe their eyes. Massive silhouettes of unfamiliar vessels loomed at the edge of their space, each one larger than any habitat they had ever built or imagined. The shapes of the ships were sharp, angular, and heavily armored, covered with unknown technologies that radiated energy in ways the colony's scientists could barely comprehend. These were not ships designed for diplomacy or transport. They were built for power, for dominance, for war. Even from a distance, their presence demanded attention, forcing every member of the colony to acknowledge that the beings responding to their SOS were unlike any they had known. At first, there was a mixture of awe and hope among the colony's population. The children pressed against the transparent walls of their habitats, their wide eyes reflecting the bright lights of the Deathworlder fleet. Adults whispered to one another, trying to rationalize the enormity of what they were seeing. Perhaps this massive force meant help, rescue, and salvation. Perhaps these ships, as terrifying as they seemed, had come to lift the colony from the brink of destruction. The scientists worked frantically to analyze the approaching fleet, searching for signs of communication or intentions that might indicate that the Deathworlders had come in peace. However, as the fleet drew closer, it became increasingly clear that the Deathworlders did not operate like the aliens expected. There were no greetings, no signals of reassurance, no calm or measured approaches. The fleet did not slow its advance in a cautious manner. Instead, the ships moved with precision as if they were already executing a plan that the colony could neither understand nor influence. The hum of energy from the vessels was deafening even across the vast distances of the colony's sensors, creating vibrations in the habitats that caused minor structural damage. Windows rattled, lights flickered, and the air was filled with a tension that was almost tangible. Panic began to ripple through the colony. Families huddled together, unsure whether to flee, hide, or prepare for the worst. The council tried to maintain order, issuing calm instructions and urging everyone to remain composed. But the fear was contagious. Engineers and defense coordinators worked tirelessly, preparing their limited weapons and shields, hoping that some display of readiness might deter the approaching force. Still, they knew their technology was no match for the Deathworlders. Even the largest defensive turrets on the outer habitats would be like toys in comparison to the might of these ships. The Deathworlders' arrival was unlike any previous encounter the colony had experienced. Even though no weapons were fired at first, the fleet's presence alone was terrifying. The aliens' communication systems picked up faint, complex signals that seemed almost like a language, but not one that any of their translators could decode. It was not a message of peace or warning. It was simply there, an undeniable assertion of power and existence. The Deathworlders communicated in ways that were physical, psychological, and technological all at once, and the colony was ill-prepared to interpret them. As the first ships moved into positions around the colony, the alien population began to understand the full scope of what they were facing. The fleet surrounded them in a deliberate formation, blocking all possible escape routes. The colony's leaders realized that this was not a friendly escort or protective shield. It was a strategic positioning that left the colony vulnerable, exposed, and trapped. Even if they had managed to repair all damaged systems and prepare defenses, the aliens knew instinctively that the Deathworlders were not here to negotiate. The sense of dread deepened with every passing minute, as the reality of the situation settled into the hearts of the colony's inhabitants. Some of the bravest members of the colony attempted to establish direct communication, sending signals, light patterns, and coded messages toward the fleet. They begged for reassurance, explanations, or guidance. They hoped that their careful attempts at diplomacy might prevent disaster. Yet every message went unanswered. The Deathworlders did not pause, slow down, or offer any form of acknowledgement. To the aliens, it was as if their attempts to communicate were invisible, meaningless, insignificant. The fleet's silence was deafening, more terrifying than any weapon fire could have been. Fear turned into chaos as minor accidents and system failures, previously caused by cosmic disturbances, were exacerbated by the stress of the fleet's arrival. Life support units began failing in some habitats, and power surges caused small fires to break out. Medical teams rushed from one location to another, doing what they could to stabilize critical patients. Parents clutched their children tightly, trying to shield them from both the physical dangers and the growing psychological terror. It became clear that even without direct attack, the Deathworlders' presence alone was a form of control, a way to exert dominance without lifting a single weapon. As hours passed, the colony's scientists continued to monitor the fleet's behavior, trying to detect any pattern or intent. They observed the precise movements of the ships, noting how each one adjusted its position in perfect coordination with the others. It was a demonstration of overwhelming power, intelligence, and organization. The more they observed, the more the scientists realized that any attempt to resist or escape would be futile. The Deathworlders' understanding of the situation was so complete, so meticulous, that the colony's survival seemed impossible. The aliens had summoned what they believed would be help, and in doing so they had invited a force whose power dwarfed their own. Despite the terror, there were still flickers of hope. Some aliens believed that if they could communicate, if they could demonstrate their intelligence or show value in some way, perhaps the Deathworlders would spare them. They tried transmitting patterns, mathematical codes, and holographic images of their society, hoping to appeal to the unknown standards of the fleet. Yet the fleet's response remained the same: movement, presence, and overwhelming strength, but no acknowledgement. The colony's leaders were faced with the horrifying realization that the Deathworlders might never respond in the way the aliens understood or expected. As the Deathworlders moved even closer, the scale of the fleet became fully apparent. Each ship was not just a vessel, it was a fortress bristling with technologies the aliens could barely identify. The engines emitted a low, steady roar that caused the colony's structures to vibrate. The shields around the habitats flickered under the subtle but persistent interference caused by the fleet's energy fields. For the first time, the aliens truly grasped the difference between their fragile existence and the immense power arrayed before them. They were small, fragile creatures in the presence of a race that lived for power, strength, and dominance. Panic reached a peak when smaller craft from the colony attempted to approach the Deathworlders, possibly to get a better sense of intent or to offer a visible sign of peace. The Deathworlders' fleet responded not with direct attack, but with maneuvers that blocked any approach, keeping the aliens at a careful distance. Every attempt at contact was neutralized, every movement carefully observed and controlled by the overwhelming presence of the Deathworlders. The aliens began to understand that the response to their SOS was not rescue. It was an inspection, an evaluation, and a display of absolute control. Within the colony, fear began to mix with disbelief. Families whispered prayers, children clung to parents, and elders reflected on their lives in a mixture of nostalgia and dread. The scientists recorded every observation, trying to make sense of what they were witnessing, but the complexity of the Deathworlders' fleet was staggering. The aliens realized that they had called for help, and in doing so they had summoned something that did not operate on the same moral or ethical rules they did. Their hope was entangled with the inevitability of their vulnerability. As night, or what passed for night in the floating habitats, fell across the colony, the citizens remained in a state of tense anticipation. The Deathworlders had not yet attacked, but their presence alone was a form of dominance. The colony's leaders gathered, trying to plan for the unknown. Could they escape? Could they survive? Was negotiation even possible? These questions had no answers. The fleet, massive and unyielding, seemed to exist for its own purpose, entirely indifferent to the fragile lives below. The story of the Deathworlders' arrival was a mixture of awe, fear, and the realization of their own insignificance. The aliens had asked for help and it had arrived, but not in a form they could understand. Hope and terror existed side by side, each feeding the other. The colony braced for what was to come, knowing that the next moments could change everything. They had entered a universe where power was the ultimate language, and survival might depend on more than just courage, intelligence, or preparation. They were about to meet a force that answered their call, but on its own terms, in ways they had never imagined, and in ways they might not survive to see. The first warning signs were subtle. A sudden surge in energy fields made the colony's lights flicker violently, and minor systems began failing in unexpected ways. At first, the aliens hoped it was a glitch, a temporary disturbance they could repair. But very quickly it became clear that the arrival of the Deathworlders was not just a presence. It was a prelude to something far more catastrophic. The massive ships, positioned strategically around the colony, emitted energy pulses that interfered with communication and navigation systems. The colony's attempts to signal or communicate were rendered useless. Panic spread through the habitats like wildfire, as the residents realized that the unknown force hovering above them was preparing to act, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Families huddled together in the central living modules, clinging to one another for comfort. Parents whispered reassurances to their children, even though their own hearts were pounding with fear. The engineers and scientists rushed from one station to another, trying desperately to stabilize failing systems. But the technology of the Deathworlders was so far beyond their understanding that their efforts were almost meaningless. The fleet's presence alone disrupted life support modules, power grids, and shield generators. The aliens were beginning to understand that this was not a rescue mission. Whatever was about to happen, it would not be gentle. Then, without warning, the first direct strike occurred. One of the outer habitats was hit by a precise high-energy pulse. The explosion was not loud in the way sound exists on planets, but it reverberated through the colony's structure, shaking walls, throwing debris into the corridors, and sending alarms screaming across the habitat. The inhabitants were thrown to the ground, some injured, many terrified beyond words. Emergency response teams raced toward the damage, trying to evacuate survivors, but more pulses followed immediately, striking other sections of the colony. Each one was calculated, targeted, and devastating. The aliens began to understand the pattern too late. The Deathworlders were not attacking randomly. They were performing a systematic dismantling of the colony's defenses, Shields that had seemed adequate moments before were shredded in seconds. Communications that the engineers had fought to restore were once again overwhelmed by interference. Even their small fleet of defensive drones was no match for the precise energy strikes. Each attempt at resistance, each small act of courage was met with overwhelming force. The colony realized with growing horror that the SOS they had sent for help had summoned a force they could not control or negotiate with. In the chaos, survival instincts took over. Families tried to flee from one habitat to another, weaving through corridors filled with smoke and debris. Some clung to escape pods, hoping to launch into open space. But the fleet's formation blocked even the smallest vessels from leaving safely. The Deathworlders had anticipated any possible escape routes and cut them off before the aliens could even react. For the inhabitants, the situation was nothing short of a nightmare. They were trapped in a cage of unimaginable power, and every movement, every attempt to survive, seemed insignificant in the face of the looming fleet. Medical teams worked frantically, treating burns, injuries from collapsing structures, and the effects of exposure to failing life support systems. Hospitals were overwhelmed within minutes. The energy strikes caused localized gravity fluctuations in some areas, throwing people off balance, causing minor crush injuries and collapsing makeshift corridors. The wounded cried out for help, while medical teams struggled to reach them through blocked passages and falling debris. Panic was now universal, touching every corner of the colony. Even the most disciplined adults were paralyzed by fear, unable to act quickly or think clearly. As the attacks continued, a horrifying reality began to sink in. The Deathworlders did not distinguish between combatants and civilians. Their strikes were not aimed at specific targets with the intention of negotiation or threat. They were absolute, mechanical, and unrelenting. Entire sections of the colony were reduced to rubble within moments. The structures that had taken decades to build were destroyed in minutes. The carefully maintained habitats, once vibrant with life and activity, now resembled the ruins of an ancient city. The residents could only watch, running where they could, praying that somehow they might survive. The air inside the habitats became thick with smoke and dust from collapsing structures. Alarms continued to blare, adding to the cacophony of chaos. Families shouted for one another, calling out in desperation, only to be drowned out by the hum of the Deathworlders' energy weapons and the screech of collapsing metal. Children screamed in fear, clinging to whatever parent or relative was nearby, unable to comprehend the scale of the destruction. The adults, too, were overwhelmed by terror, grief, and disbelief. This was no ordinary attack. This was annihilation performed with precision, efficiency, and utter indifference. Some survivors tried to flee through tunnels connecting various habitats, hoping to reach safer zones. But the Deathworlders' presence interfered with navigation systems, making even the familiar passages disorienting and dangerous. Collapsing floors, failing lights, and intermittent gravity fluctuations turned simple corridors into death traps. It became clear that the aliens were facing not only an external enemy, but the breakdown of everything that had allowed them to survive in this harsh corner of space. The familiar became alien, and every step was a risk. Amid the destruction, acts of courage and desperation emerged. Engineers worked tirelessly to divert power to critical systems, even as sections of the colony crumbled around them. Parents shielded children from falling debris, often risking their own lives. Small groups of survivors banded together, sharing what supplies they had and helping each other navigate the chaos. Yet no matter how brave or resourceful they were, the scale of the Deathworlders' power was overwhelming. For every action taken, the fleet had already anticipated, countered, or obliterated it. Survival seemed less about skill and more about luck. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Fear turned to panic and panic to despair. Survivors began to experience a sense of helplessness so intense that many froze, unable to move or think. Others acted recklessly, abandoning strategy in a desperate attempt to survive. Families were separated, friends lost, and entire communities wiped out in moments. The colony, once united and orderly, now existed as a fragmented collection of terrified individuals and small groups, scattered amid the ruins of what had once been a thriving civilization. By the time the Deathworlders paused, the damage was catastrophic. The colony's defenses were obliterated, life support systems were failing in many sections, and communication with the outside universe was almost completely severed. The survivors, those who had somehow endured the initial strikes, were left to navigate a landscape of death and destruction. The fleet's pause was not a moment of relief. It was simply a demonstration that the Deathworlders had achieved their objective. They had shown their power, dismantled resistance, and left the colony in a state of utter vulnerability. In the aftermath of the initial strikes, the aliens struggled to comprehend what had happened. Entire habitats once bustling with activity now lay in ruins. The survivors floated through corridors littered with debris, trying to locate loved ones, salvage essential resources, or find safe zones. Many were injured, exhausted, and overwhelmed by grief. For some, hope had vanished entirely. For others, it lingered faintly, a fragile ember that might keep them alive for just a little longer. Yet all understood that their situation was precarious, that even the simplest tasks were now a struggle for survival in the face of destruction. The Deathworlders' strategy became painfully clear. They did not need to communicate, negotiate, or show mercy. Their very presence and the destruction they had wrought were enough to establish dominance. The colony, which had hoped for rescue, was now under the control of a force so powerful that even the act of breathing seemed dangerous. Every system they relied on, navigation, communication, power, life support, had been compromised. The residents were forced to confront the terrifying realization that the beings who answered their SOS had brought not aid, but annihilation. Even in the midst of despair, the survivors struggled to act. Some groups attempted to flee through damaged escape pods, hoping to reach open space. Others sought refuge in intact habitats, barricading themselves against the relentless energy pulses. Children were carried through debris-strewn corridors, elders assisted in navigating failing systems, and engineers continued to attempt repairs despite knowing that the scale of the destruction was almost certainly beyond their capabilities. Each small act of bravery was a testament to the resilience of the colony, even as the weight of the Deathworlders' overwhelming power loomed above them. By the end of the attacks, the alien colony had been fundamentally transformed. What had once been a thriving, organized civilization was now scattered, broken, and terrified. Survivors counted their losses, tended to the injured, and tried to process the horror of what had occurred. They understood that the Deathworlders had not attacked out of anger, spite, or malice. They had acted according to their own logic, a logic of power, efficiency, and dominance. The colony had learned a brutal lesson. In the vast universe, SOS calls could bring not salvation, but unimaginable destruction, and as the Deathworlders' fleet hovered silently over the ruined colony, the survivors realized the full weight of their predicament. They had called for help, and in response, a force far beyond their comprehension had arrived, not as saviors but as an unstoppable, destructive presence. The once peaceful colony now existed under a shadow of fear and uncertainty, forced to survive in a universe where hope could be as dangerous as it was fragile. The colony lay in ruins. What had once been a bustling network of habitats alive with activity and hope was now reduced to a fragmented collection of debris, floating modules, and twisted metal. Smoke rose from the shattered structures, casting a gray haze across the dark expanse of space. The energy fields of the Deathworlders' fleet had dissipated after their initial attack, leaving the survivors to face a new, terrifying reality. The destruction was over, but the threat remained. The Deathworlders had not pursued them further, yet their presence lingered like a shadow, an unspoken warning that they could return at any moment. The surviving aliens emerged from the wreckage in stunned silence. Some were injured, clutching burns or lacerations sustained during the bombardment. Others wandered in shock, unable to fully comprehend what had happened to their home. Families were scattered. Friends who had once worked and lived together now found themselves separated, calling out names that might never be answered. Even those who had made it through the initial attacks physically unharmed were psychologically shaken. The sheer scale of the destruction, combined with the knowledge that it had been inflicted by beings of unimaginable power, weighed heavily on every survivor. Amid the chaos, a few groups of survivors gathered together, instinctively forming small communities within the wreckage. They scavenged for resources, searching through the debris for food, water, and working systems. The engineers and scientists tried to assess what could be salvaged, attempting to bring life support back online in isolated modules. Every small success was a temporary relief, quickly overshadowed by the overwhelming sense of loss and despair. The colony that had once operated as a cohesive, thriving society now existed as a collection of desperate individuals clinging to fragments of survival. Communication became a central concern. With much of their communication infrastructure destroyed, the survivors struggled to reach one another. Those who managed to establish contact with other isolated groups found that distances that had once been trivial now seemed insurmountable. Rescue operations, even within the colony itself, were chaotic. Groups sent out to search for missing people had to navigate collapsed corridors, blocked pathways, and malfunctioning life support systems. It was a slow, exhausting process, fraught with the risk of further injury or death. Psychological strain grew heavier with each passing hour. Survivors grappled with grief, guilt, and fear, trying to reconcile the life they had known with the devastation surrounding them. Many adults took on the responsibility of caring for children who had witnessed horrors far beyond their understanding. They comforted them as best they could, holding them close, telling stories, and attempting to create a sense of normalcy in the midst of chaos. The children, in turn, clung to their caregivers, their small bodies trembling with fear and confusion, unable to comprehend the magnitude of what had happened. The Council of the Colony, or what remained of it, convened in a partially intact habitat. Leaders and senior members assessed the situation, trying to determine what steps could be taken next. They debated whether to attempt to rebuild, flee to nearby asteroids, or find ways to survive in isolation until help might arrive, if it ever did. The consensus was grim. The Deathworlders had demonstrated their superiority, and any attempt at direct confrontation was hopeless. Survival, they realized, depended on adaptability, ingenuity, and patience. Their focus shifted from rebuilding what was lost to finding ways to endure in the immediate aftermath of destruction. Among the survivors, stories began to emerge. Individuals recounted the moments of the attack, the energy pulses that had torn through habitats, and the courage of those who had risked everything to save others. These stories spread through the colony, forming a collective memory of the devastation. They were harrowing tales filled with fear and loss, but they also highlighted resilience, bravery, and solidarity. Even in the face of overwhelming odds, acts of kindness and courage became beacons of hope, reminding the survivors that they were not entirely alone. As survivors navigated the wreckage, they discovered pockets of life that had somehow withstood the assault. Some habitats had remained partially intact, protected by their location or sheer luck. In these areas, survivors gathered, sharing resources, repairing systems, and attempting to create safe zones. Engineers focused on restoring basic functions such as air circulation, power generation, and water purification. Every small achievement was celebrated, not as a triumph over the Deathworlders, but as a proof that life could continue despite the devastation. Yet even as the survivors worked to stabilize their environment, the psychological scars were evident. Many experienced nightmares, flashbacks, and anxiety, triggered by the smallest sounds or movements. Children asked questions that adults could not answer, and even the most resilient adults found themselves overwhelmed by despair at times. The survivors began to understand that the real battle was not just against the immediate dangers of the destroyed habitats, but also against fear, trauma, and the knowledge of their vulnerability in a universe filled with incomprehensible forces. Over time, the survivors developed new routines. They moved cautiously through the debris, mapped safe paths, and created shelters within partially intact habitats. Food and water were rationed carefully, and small communities established rules to maintain order and cooperation. Every day became a struggle for survival, yet within that struggle there was also a sense of determination. The aliens refused to give in entirely to despair. They had survived the initial attack, and now their focus was on enduring, adapting, and protecting what remained of their community. The story of the attack began to spread beyond the colony itself. Some survivors managed to send out signals using remaining communication systems, warning nearby settlements of the Deathworlders' power and the risks of encountering them. These messages were fragmented, desperate, and incomplete, but they carried a warning that would echo through the surrounding systems. The tale of the colony's destruction became a cautionary story, a reminder of the fragility of life in a universe dominated by forces beyond comprehension. Even in the midst of devastation, moments of humanity emerged. Survivors shared stories, comforted each other, and supported one another in ways that transcended fear. Acts of courage and selflessness became vital for morale, reminding the colony that life could endure even in the most dire circumstances. Elders provided guidance, children offered hope, and the survivors collectively began to rebuild not just their habitats, but their sense of community and purpose. The ruins became a foundation, a place from which they could attempt to recover even if full restoration was impossible. The alien colony, scarred and battered, now existed in a delicate balance. Life continued, but it was marked by caution, vigilance, and a new understanding of the dangers of the wider universe. The survivors had learned that not every SOS brought help, and that power often came without compassion. The Deathworlders had left a permanent mark, not only on the physical structures of the colony but also on the hearts and minds of those who remained. Fear and hope coexisted, intertwined, shaping every decision, every movement, and every thought. As days passed, the colony stabilized enough to allow for tentative exploration beyond the immediate wreckage. Small teams ventured into distant, damaged habitats to search for survivors and salvage resources. Each successful rescue reinforced the fragile sense of hope that had begun to grow among the survivors. The lessons of the attack, caution, resourcefulness, and cooperation became ingrained in every action. The survivors were determined not to let despair dominate them, knowing that their survival depended on unity and adaptability. The long-term impact of the destruction was evident. The colony's population had been drastically reduced, its infrastructure shattered, and its sense of security permanently altered. Yet within the ruins, the seeds of resilience had taken root. Survivors had learned to navigate the dangers of their environment, to work together under extreme pressure, and to maintain hope even in the darkest hours. The Deathworlders' attack had changed everything, but it had also revealed the strength and determination of the aliens. In the aftermath, the survivors began to rebuild not just for survival, but for the future. Plans were made to create shelters that were better protected, communication systems that could withstand interference, and escape routes in case of future threats. Education and knowledge sharing became vital, as the younger generation needed to understand both the power of the universe and the lessons learned from the attack. The colony, though forever scarred, was slowly learning to adapt to the harsh new reality imposed by the Deathworlders' arrival. The survivors also grappled with questions of morality, intent, and understanding. The Deathworlders had acted without mercy, yet there was no malice in their logic. It was simply power expressed without consideration for smaller civilizations. The aliens struggled to comprehend a force so vast and incomprehensible, and in doing so, they gained a new perspective on the fragility of life, the importance of preparation, and the unpredictability of the cosmos. Ultimately, the aftermath of the attack became a story of survival, adaptation, and the enduring will to live. The colony had been devastated, yet those who remained found ways to carry on. They rebuilt what they could, nurtured hope where it seemed impossible, and learned lessons that would guide them for generations. The experience left them forever changed, but it also instilled a resilience that would define their future. Even in the face of destruction beyond imagining, life continued and the survivors refused to be broken. Time passed and the surviving aliens slowly began to rebuild their lives, though the shadow of the Deathworlders' destruction hung heavily over them. The colony that had once been a thriving, bustling network of habitats now existed as a smaller, more fragile community. The survivors carried both the physical scars of the attack and the psychological weight of what they had endured. They had seen their homes destroyed, friends and family lost, and the limits of their own power exposed. Yet even in the midst of grief and fear, they discovered a remarkable resilience, a determination to continue, to survive, and to learn from their experiences. Rebuilding was not easy. Resources were limited, and much of what had supported the colony before the attack had been destroyed. Engineers and scientists worked tirelessly to repair damaged habitats, restore basic life support systems, and salvage whatever materials they could find. Every repaired habitat, every restored generator, and every functioning communication module felt like a small victory. The survivors took pride in these accomplishments, knowing that each step forward was a testament to their courage and ingenuity. Slowly, order began to return to a community that had been torn apart. Even as they rebuilt physically, the survivors had to rebuild socially and emotionally. Families reunited where possible, and small groups formed tight-knit communities to support one another. The shared experience of surviving such a catastrophic event created bonds that were stronger than anything the colony had experienced before. Trust, cooperation, and mutual support became essential, as every action and decision could mean the difference between life and death. The aliens learned to rely on one another in ways they had never imagined, creating a new social structure forged in the crucible of disaster. At the same time, the survivors reflected on the lessons of the attack. They had called for help, and their SOS had been answered. But the answer had not brought aid, only destruction. This harsh truth reshaped their understanding of the universe and their place within it. They realized that not all who responded to a plea for help could be trusted, and that power often came without compassion. The Deathworlders had acted according to their own logic, demonstrating strength, control, and efficiency without regard for smaller civilizations. The aliens understood that survival required both caution and preparation, and that hope alone was not enough in a universe where forces beyond comprehension could intervene at any moment. The survivors also began to document what had happened. They recorded the events of the attack in meticulous detail: the initial arrival of the Deathworlders, the sequence of destruction, the behavior of the fleet, and the experiences of those who had survived. These records were intended not just as a historical account, but as a warning and lesson for future generations. They hoped that by preserving this knowledge, others could avoid similar mistakes, better understand the dangers of the galaxy, and prepare themselves for encounters with forces far beyond their comprehension. The stories of courage, loss, and resilience became central to the colony's culture, providing both guidance and inspiration. The psychological impact of the attack remained profound. Survivors struggled with trauma, nightmares, and the fear that the Deathworlders might return. Some isolated themselves, unable to face the reminders of the destruction. Others became fiercely protective of their communities, refusing to let vulnerability define them. Over time, coping mechanisms developed. Survivors shared their experiences, comforted one another, and found small rituals to reclaim a sense of normalcy. They planted gardens in surviving habitats, repaired communal spaces, and celebrated even minor achievements. These acts of rebuilding life were as much about restoring hope as they were about restoring function. Beyond the colony itself, the story of the Deathworlders' attack began to spread across the galaxy. Other civilizations, hearing of the devastation, approached SOS signals with caution, wary of calling attention to themselves. The tale of the aliens' misjudgment became a lesson in interstellar diplomacy, survival, and the unpredictable nature of power. Neighboring systems took note of the Deathworlders' capabilities, and rumors of their efficiency and ruthlessness traveled faster than any official communication. The survivor's story became a warning that hope, while essential, could be dangerous if placed in the wrong hands, and that understanding the nature of those who might respond was as important as the act of asking for help itself. In the colony, the survivors began to train the next generation in ways that ensured they would never again be caught so unprepared. Children learned about engineering, navigation, resource management, and survival skills. They were taught about the Deathworlders, their power, and the importance of caution. Education became a central pillar of the rebuilt society, emphasizing both knowledge and resilience. The adults understood that survival was not just about living in the present. It was about preparing the next generation to face a universe that could be as cruel as it was vast. The survivors also became more strategic in their approach to the universe. They developed protocols for communication, reinforced habitats, and created escape routes. They studied the methods of the Deathworlders, attempting to understand their logic and anticipate future interactions with similar forces. Every lesson learned became a tool for survival, every experience a foundation for adaptation. The colony evolved from a peaceful, isolated community into one that was cautious, vigilant, and more resilient than ever before. They had learned to survive not just by hope, but by understanding, planning, and strength born from experience. Despite the trauma, there were moments of triumph. Slowly, the colony's population stabilized. Survivors found loved ones, rebuilt relationships, and began to reclaim aspects of their previous lives. Communities gathered for meals, celebrations, and commemorations of those lost in the attack. Art, music, and culture flourished in small ways, even in the aftermath of devastation. These moments of normalcy reminded the survivors that life could endure, even after catastrophe, and that human or alien spirit was capable of remarkable resilience. The Deathworlders themselves became a symbol of both fear and respect. The survivors understood that these beings were not malicious in the way smaller civilizations might define evil. They were simply forces of power operating under their own rules. The encounter changed the colony's perception of the universe. The galaxy was not a safe or predictable place. It was vast, indifferent, and filled with entities whose actions could alter entire civilizations in an instant. The survivors learned humility, caution, and the importance of strength, both physical and mental, in navigating such a universe. Over time, the colony adapted to its new reality. Habitats were reinforced with stronger materials, defenses were rebuilt, and redundancies were created to protect against future disasters. The survivors became adept at problem-solving under pressure, able to make critical decisions with limited information. Every small success reinforced their confidence, demonstrating that even in the face of overwhelming power, life could endure. The colony's culture evolved to value resilience, cooperation, and preparedness, ensuring that future generations would be equipped to face challenges they could not yet imagine. The experience also left a deep philosophical impact on the survivors. They reflected on the nature of power, the unpredictability of the universe, and the importance of understanding forces beyond their control. They learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. They understood that survival depended on knowledge, preparation, and unity, and that hope alone was not sufficient in a galaxy filled with overwhelming forces. These lessons became the moral foundation of the colony's rebirth, guiding every decision and shaping every action. Even decades later, the attack remained a defining moment for the colony. It was a story passed down through generations, not only as a historical account but as a source of identity. The survivors and their descendants carried the memory of the Deathworlders' arrival, the destruction, and the remarkable resilience required to endure. It became a tale of survival, adaptation, and the enduring will to live, a testament to the strength of life in the face of forces far beyond comprehension. Ultimately, the colony emerged stronger, though forever changed. They had experienced unimaginable destruction, faced beings of overwhelming power, and survived when so much had been lost. They had learned lessons that no history or simulation could teach, gained wisdom through suffering, and developed a resilience that ensured their survival in a dangerous universe. The Deathworlders had left a permanent mark on their world and their minds, shaping their society, their culture, and their understanding of what it meant to survive. And so, the colony endured. Life continued, fragile but persistent. The survivors rebuilt not just structures but communities, relationships, and a sense of purpose. They carried with them the lessons of the past, the memory of those lost, and the determination to survive whatever the universe might send next. Their SOS had brought destruction, but it had also forged a new strength, a recognition that in a vast and unpredictable galaxy, the ability to endure, adapt, and learn was the most powerful tool of all.